In the month of June in the year 1942, the German forces failed to accomplish their chief objective of acquiring the region extending up to Astrakhan, which was the primary target of the Barbarossa operation. Furthermore, they were unable to seize Moscow and had been unsuccessful in breaching the Soviet defenses, despite laying siege to Leningrad. A furious Hitler, desiring to attack Moscow once again, decided to launch a distinct offensive against Soviet territory. Unfortunately, fate didn't favor the Nazi troops as they were gradually buried one by one, and Stalingrad would ultimately mark the commencement of the downfall of Hitler. Prior to the commencement of the operation, the German Southern Army Group was bifurcated into two distinct units, Army Group A and Army Group B. The former, under the leadership of General William List, was tasked with marching towards the Caucasus to seize the coveted oil fields in Baku. Meanwhile, Army Group B, commanded by General Fedor von Bock, was entrusted with securing control over the Don and Volga rivers to prevent any potential Soviet offensives from the north. This German offensive was bolstered by an impressive land force of 1.57 million soldiers, complemented by 2,035 warplanes and 1,900 tanks. On the morning of June 28th, Hitler issued orders for both armies to launch a southward assault. The Germans swiftly advanced 300 km in a mere week and by July 7th had successfully captured Voronezh. Stalin, anticipating that the Germans would target Moscow, had stationed 1.7 million Soviet soldiers needlessly in front of the capital. Consequently, the few Soviet soldiers positioned in the south were quickly overwhelmed by the German invasion. The German army continued to make headway, advancing from the Don River towards the south. On July 26th, managed to capture the strategically important city of Rostov. Meanwhile, the largest army in Army Group B, the 6th Army, led by General Paulus, began its march towards Stalingrad without the support of tanks. However, their progress began to slow down considerably due to the fierce and relentless counterattacks of the Red Army soldiers, who were deployed to the front of August the 1st. As a consequence, General Paulus was compelled to request assistance from the Luftwaffe. On August the 1st, the highly effective air unit, German Stuka planes, relentlessly bombarded the Soviet front, resulting in the destruction of 58 tanks, 5,000 Soviet soldiers, and fuel supply depots. Shifting our focus to Army A, we observed that the Germans successfully crossed the Don River and proceed southward towards the Caucasus, effectively capturing Maikop and Elista, where the highly coveted oil fields were located, by August 13th. However, the Soviet resistance intensified significantly at this point, and coupled with numerous supply chain disruptions, the German advance came to a grinding halt. Despite the numerous attempts, the Soviet defenses couldn't be breached, and with the winter on the horizon, Army Group A's commander, General List, realized that the capture of Baku within the stipulated timeline was no longer feasible. Consequently, he resorted to air bombardments to destroy the oil fields in Grozny. Hitler was incensed by this failure and promptly replaced General List with Ewald von Kleist as the new commander of the Army A before September. However, Hitler had imposed stringent restrictions on General Kleist, compelling him to act only with the explicit consent, thereby ensuring that the true command still rested in Hitler's hands. The Soviet army seized this opportunity to regroup, given that both German army groups had fallen behind their targets, thereby enabling them to reinforce the defense of Stalingrad. In early September, the Axis forces departed from Romania, embarking on a perilous journey towards the southern front, with 50,000 soldiers and 6,265 motorized vehicles in tow. Despite the successful capture of most of the Black Sea naval bases upon reinforcement, the Germans encountered a significant roadblock in the form of Novorossiysk, beyond which they were unable to make any substantial progress. In the ensuing days, an additional 50,000 Romanian soldiers were deployed, landing at the Novorossiysk port. However, their arrival was short-lived, as they were vanquished within a mere 10 days, courtesy of a devastating Soviet counter-offensive. Shifting our attention to Army Group B, we observed that the Germans were successful in driving the Soviets out of most of the western bank of the Don River until August 10, 1942. However, the sporadic and persistent Soviet resistance in certain areas caused significant delays in the German advance towards Stalingrad. Consequently, Army Group B commander Fedor von Bock was relieved of his duties by Hitler and replaced by General Maximilian von Weiss. The heavy losses suffered by the Germans in the harsh Soviet defense on the Don made it necessary for Hitler to send additional troops to the Stalingrad front. Eventually, on August 23rd, the 6th Army, under the command of Paulus, successfully crossed the Don River, establishing a defensive line 60 km away from Stalingrad. Hitler lauded General Paulus for his achievement and ordered the 4th Panzer Army to proceed towards Stalingrad to lend support to the 6th Army. However, the narrow and muddy forest road caused a significant traffic jam, with thousands of vehicles from the 4th and 1st Panzer Armies causing delays in the German advance by at least a week. Simultaneously, the German air forces launched a relentless assault on the city of Stalingrad, leaving much of it in ruins. The civilian casualties resulting from this barrage were nothing short of catastrophic, with 955 dead and 1,181 wounded in just 3 days. With the aid of the 4th Panzer Army, the Nazi forces began to encircle Stalingrad, slowly tightening their grip on the city. This resulted in all of the Soviet armies and the city's supplies having to be transported via boats on the Volga River from September onwards. In a bid to render this supply chain inoperable, the German air forces embarked on a relentless bombing campaign, causing significant damage to the boats and leading to a dire shortage of both ammunition and food. On September 4th, the southernmost panzer units came perilously close to the city, but the following day, the advance was halted due to the fierce counterattack by Soviet soldiers under the command of General Zhukov. Once again, the German air forces played a pivotal role, bombarding the Soviet artillery positions and defense lines, thereby helping to repel the attack. Within a few hours, the Soviets were forced to retreat, losing a staggering 30 out of 120 tanks in the ensuing airstrikes. One of the high-ranking generals on the Stalingrad front, Andrei Yarmolenko, urgently conveyed to Stalin that a full-scale attack against the German forces was the only viable option to thwart their advance, failing which the city of Stalingrad would inevitably succumb to this Nazi onslaught. With Stalin's concurrence, a massive Soviet counteroffensive led by General Zhukov was launched, but unfortunately it proved to be futile, owing to both the effective operations of the German air forces and an acute shortage of troops. In the battle that ensued on September 6th, a staggering 20 of the Soviet tanks out of 90 in service were decimated by the Luftwaffe. The following day, the attack was resumed, but once again, the desired outcome remained elusive. In spite of several attempts by the Soviets to breach the German defenses, repeated until September 10th, the city's airport eventually fell into the hands of the Germans. Subsequent to the Soviet counterattacks, the German forces began to advance towards the city of Santa, forcing the Soviet defense to retreat from the outer neighborhoods towards the inner parts of the city on September 12th. General Zhukov, the commander of the 62nd Army, chronicled these tumultuous days in his diary, stating that September 13, 14 and 15 were exceedingly arduous and trying for Stalingrad. We felt powerless to halt the enemy's advance and that the city was on the brink of being overrun. In a bid to stem the tide of retreat, Stalin issued a stern decree warning that any commander who ordered a retreat would be subjected to military tribunals, whereas any soldiers caught impersonating illness or deserting would be executed without mercy. The highest number of arrests and executions during the conflict were reported in the 62nd Army, with 49 soldiers being executed and 139 soldiers receiving various forms of punishment. On September 14th, the Germans launched their first assault on the city, endeavoring to capture the Mamayev Kurgan hill while simultaneously attempting to infiltrate the central train station from a different direction. The ensuing battle was characterized by intense and ferocious fighting, resulting in the train station changing hands an astonishing 14 times in a mere 6 hours. However, the majority of the German troops who participated in the attack were decimated by the Soviet defense, whereas the Soviet side suffered losses amounting to more than 30% of their soldiers within the first 24 hours of the attack. Out of 10,000 soldiers who valiantly defended their trenches, only 320 survived, but they managed to hold on to both Mamayev Hill and the train station, thereby thwarting the German advance. A group of Soviet soldiers led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov entered a 4-story building in a strategically important location in the city center, which later came to be known as Pavlov's house. The soldiers surrounded the building with mines and set up machine gun positions at the windows. Remarkably, this 20-member unit, which received minimal reinforcements until the end of the Stalingrad battle, never relinquished control of the building to the Germans. Subsequently, the building was designated as a fortress on German maps, and Sergeant Pavlov was awarded the prestigious title of Hero of the Soviet Union. As of September 27, the German forces had succeeded in occupying the southern section of the city, but had failed to seize the crucial targets along the riverbanks. The Soviet army continued to put up a formidable defense, fiercely guarding the riverbanks, the city center, and the northern regions of the city. Following September 27, the brunt of the conflict in the city of Stalingrad shifted towards the north and an industrial zone. The Germans, hampered by the unyielding Soviet resistance, made sluggish progress, but eventually succeeded in capturing the 3 largest industrial facilities in Stalingrad on October 10th. By the end of October, Soviet control over the city had dwindled considerably, and the area they controlled had shrunk to a mere handful of meters along the west bank of the Volga River. It is worth noting that the German Air Force played a pivotal role in this, having carried out a staggering 20,000 sorties by mid-November, dropping an astounding 600 tons of bombs on the city. By early November, the Soviet army had suffered a staggering loss of 60,000 soldiers, primarily due to the devastating air strikes. In comparison, the Germans had lost about 17,000 soldiers, with an additional 3,000 missing and 52,000 injured. Furthermore, the Soviet army had managed to shoot down 650 of the 1,600 planes in the Luftwaffe during this period. As the war raged on with unabated ferocity, Stalin was acutely aware of the dire situation at Stalingrad. In a desperate bid to turn the tide of the conflict, he summoned senior generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky to Moscow and instructed them to devise a plan for the immediate expulsion of the Germans from Stalingrad. At Stalin's behest, a staggering 1.7 million Soviet soldiers from the front near Moscow were dispatched to Stalingrad as reinforcements. But the onset of the winter and the subsequent freezing of the Volga River posed a significant obstacle to their transportation. Zhukov was acutely aware of the urgency of the situation and was compelled to find a viable solution to this daunting challenge. On the German front, although they had seized control of 90% of the city, their progress had ground to a halt as they were ill-equipped to handle winter warfare. Moreover, their unwavering focus on the city had led them to neglect fortifying their positions around downriver, and they had failed to take necessary precautions at the bridgeheads in the north, where Soviet forces had mounted numerous attacks in the past. Similarly, the northwest and southwest fronts of the city were held solely by the Romanian army, which lacked the discipline of the Germans and possessed vastly inferior equipment. Soviet General Zhukov astutely recognized these vulnerabilities in his adversaries and planned the Uranus operation accordingly. According to the plan, the 1 million troops sent as reinforcements will be deployed to the northwest and southwest regions, where Romanian forces were stationed, rather than entering Stalingrad. This would enable the Soviet army to swiftly overpower the weak Romanian army and circle the German Sixth Army, which had surrounded the Soviet army in the city from behind. To execute this operation, a staggering force of 1.1 million soldiers, 800 tanks, 13,500 artillery pieces, and more than 1,000 aircraft were mobilized. However, due to the harsh winter conditions, the Uranus operation had to be postponed twice, first to November 17 and then November 19. At 7:20 a.m. Moscow time and 5:20 a.m. German time on November 19, Soviet artillery commanders unleashed a devastating barrage against the Romanian forces guarding the flanks. This sudden and unexpected bombardment caught the 3rd Romanian Army off guard, causing them to retreat and abandon their positions amidst the thick smoke and fog. The Romanian soldiers, deprived of communication due to damaged lines, were confounded by the incoming Soviet shells and lacked clear directives. Some of those who survived the initial bombardment hastily abandoned their posts and commenced a disordered retreat. In response, Soviet artillery swiftly targeted the second line of Romanian defenses, further decimating the retreating soldiers. At 8:50 a.m., the Soviet army and tanks launched an assault against the 3rd Romanian army. Initially, the Romanian defense held strong and repelled the attack. However, the absence of the adequate anti-attack guns proved to be their undoing, and their defense rapidly crumbled, triggering a mass retreat around noon. Tragically for the 3rd Romanian army, they were already encircled by Soviet forces from both the west and the east. In a desperate bid to aid the Romanian forces, General Pauses of the 6th Army dispatched 100 tanks to support them. Regrettably, due to their low fuel supply, only 30 of these tanks managed to reach the combat zone, and half of them were destroyed by Soviet tanks within 2 days. As a severe snowstorm descended on November 19th, the Soviet forces continued their advance southwards, while the coordination between the German and Romanian troops, who were unaccustomed to winter warfare, became increasingly disrupted. On the southern front, in the early hours of November 19th, the Soviet army launched a ferocious assault against the 3rd Romanian army. Astonishingly, within just 5 hours of attack, the Soviets had managed to capture a staggering force of 27,000 Romanian soldiers. While Soviet planes relentlessly bombed the retreating Romanian forces under arduous conditions, German planes were unable to intervene, save for a few feeble sorties. On November 20th, General Yeryomenko's forces began to encircle the German 6th Army from the south by opening a corridor through the area that the Romanians had abandoned near the Volga River. Meanwhile, the Soviet army in the northwest swiftly advanced towards Stalingrad, penetrating up to 50 kilometers into the city by November 21st. By this time, Romanian forces to the north of the 6th Army had been completely decimated, and the Red Army had begun engaging in the battle with the German 4th Panzer and 6th Army wings. Notably, Soviet tanks in the northwest also made rapid progress towards the south in an attempt to sever the German supply corridor. The German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army now found themselves ensnared within an ever-tightening Soviet encirclement. On November 22nd, Soviet forces began crossing the Don River and continued to make headway towards the city. However, General Paulus' 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army remained trapped within Stalingrad, having been completely enveloped by Soviet forces on November 22nd. General Paulus and his beleaguered forces, ensconced amidst the chaos and carnage, began to suffer from a dearth of vital resources such as fuel, ammunition, and food. Hitler, in a desperate bid to supply the 6th Army, opted to rely on air transport, but a staggering 680 tons of supplies were required every day for 300,000 soldiers encircled in Stalingrad, a seemingly impossible feat for Luftwaffe to accomplish under the harsh winter conditions. Adding to their woes, the Soviet Air Force had gained the upper hand and posed a grave threat to German planes attempting to fly over the encirclement. Consequently, the sole resource to rescue the trapped German forces was through a ground operation, a seemingly insurmountable task that only one individual was willing to undertake: Erich von Manstein. The German army, beleaguered until December 10th, suffered grievous losses due to the ravages of hunger and the unforgiving winter conditions. Meanwhile, the Red Army redoubled its outer siege, poised to obliterate the trapped German troops. On December 12, 1942, General Manstein launched a rescue operation dubbed Winter Storm. Which entailed the deployment of roughly 120,000 German soldiers, 350 tanks, and 200 planes to liberate their besieged compatriots. Initially, the Germans made considerable headway, with some units covering up to 60 kilometers. However, the tide of this rescue operation began to turn on December 15th, when Stalin ordered 90,000 troops from the Don front to be transferred to the Stalin front to vanquish the encircled German units. Thereafter, Manstein dispatched an intelligence officer to General Paulus, urging him to break the siege and establish contact with their forces. However, Paulus reported that the tanks of the 6th Army had only 30 kilometers of fuel remaining, and his forces lacked the fortitude to attempt an escape under such harsh winter conditions. On December 18th, General Paulus sent a message to Hitler, expressing his readiness to surrender, which Hitler vehemently rebuffed. Meanwhile, Manstein continued his efforts to breach the Soviet front for 4 days between December 18th and 22nd, but to no avail. With the added burden of fuel and food shortages and the unrelenting winter conditions, Manstein's operation had reached an impasse. After assessing the situation, Manstein began withdrawing his forces on December 24th, marking the unsuccessful end of the Winter Storm operation. From that point forward, the Red Army, which had mobilized to annihilate the Axis forces in Stalingrad, initiated the Caucasus operation. General Rokossovsky, who had been appointed by the Red Army High Command to lead the operation, issued a call for General Paulus to surrender on January 7, 1943. Rokossovsky promised that all prisoners would be saved, food aid would be provided, and medical support would be extended to the sick if Paulus surrendered within 24 hours. General Paulus sought Hitler's permission to surrender once again, but Hitler swiftly rebuffed the proposal. On January 22nd, when Rokossovsky once again offered Paulus a chance to surrender, Paulus requested time to assess the situation. On January 30th, Paulus contacted Hitler, seeking permission to surrender as he could no longer command men who were bereft of ammunition and food. However, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, which is called General Feldmarschall, effectively compelling him to either fight to the bitter end or take his own life, since no German marshal had ever surrendered before. Hitler believed that Paulus would either fight to the death or commit suicide, but he was proven wrong. The following day, Soviet troops entered a ruined building and encountered Paulus and his staff. Paulus surrounded with his staff, but he refused to call upon his soldiers to surrender. Thus, intermittent German-Soviet clashes persisted until the morning of February 2nd, when around 91,000 emaciated, ailing, wounded, and starving German soldiers surrendered. Among the captives were 22 German generals, aside from Paulus himself. Tragically, only 5,000 of 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered survived, with the remainder perishing in POW camps due to the illness, cold, or starvation. Marshal Paulus remained a prisoner in the Soviet Union until 1952 before relocating to Dresden, East Germany. In our third video of the World War II series, we will delve into the German retreat to Berlin and eventual collapse of Hitler's Germany. If you wish to see this video soon, kindly show your support by liking and leaving encouraging comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.